Thanks to Dungeons & Dragons and 50 Shades of Grey, the idea of a dungeon has become somewhat romanticized of late. As if you were to enter one, most would expect a room full of nerds at worst, and at best, you might even discover how much you love nipple clamps. However, dungeons from days gone past were a much murkier affair, as are the dungeons still operated today, as we're about to discover in our list of the 7 creepiest dungeons in history. In at number 7, the Fritzl Dungeon. On August 29, 1984, Elizabeth Fritzl helped her father Josef carry a door down into the basement of their home in Amstetten, Austria. But little did she know that by helping him put that door in place, she was sealing herself inside an underground dungeon, which would be her home for the next 24 years. At first glance, you may think that with a living area, bathroom, and 2 separate bedrooms, as dungeons go, this one's pretty ritzy. But this comfort was there for a reason. For Josef Fritzl would be spending a lot of time down here with his daughter, and it wasn't to read her bedtime stories. Elizabeth was trapped here from the age of 18, and by the time she escaped, she'd given birth to 7 children courtesy of her father's ancestral attentions. 1 child died shortly after birth, 3 were cared for in the dungeon by Elizabeth, and the other 3 were adopted by Josef and his wife Rosemary, with Josef claiming he simply found the children outside his home. Shockingly, Fritzl's wife Rosemary was completely unaware what was happening beneath her feet, as she was banned from the basement where Fritzl designed machinery during the day, keeping their daughter behind an electronically locked door just meters away. Over the years, Josef faked letters from their daughter as if she'd joined a cult, and even more chillingly, hundreds of other people also lived in the large apartment building above this dungeon, all completely oblivious as to the horrors taking place just a few meters below. Makes you wonder, what's going on in the basement of your apartment building? 6. The Bottle Dungeon. Are you thinking of building your own dungeon of exquisite agony, but don't want to spend all that money on expensive chains, racks, and iron maidens? Then why not consider the dreaded Oubliette instead? This style of dungeon doesn't need equipment to make it torturous, because its design is frightening enough. Also known as bottle dungeons, these literal hellholes consist of a windowless chamber buried deep into the ground which can only be accessed via a single trapdoor. Prisoners are lowered down a tight, narrow opening, and at the bottom, out of reach of the trapdoor, they'll find a cramped cell, too small to lie down in. Not that you'd want to, since this type of dungeon often fills with groundwater and human waste pretty quickly. The term oubliette borrows from the French word oublier, which means to forget, and these dungeons have been found in some of the most famous castles and prisons in the world, including the Bastille and St. Andrews. In England's aptly named Chillingham Castle, they even have scratch marks adorning the walls, because here, several prisoners at a time were known to be forced into one single cell, and when food became scarce, they were known to feed on the flesh of their deceased cellmates. So knowing your fate lies in one of these dungeons is bad enough, but imagine if it was all a surprise, as it would have been for prisoners of Turkey's Black Tower in Rumeli Hisara. Here, prisoners weren't lowered into the dungeon, they were tricked into walking down a narrow, dark corridor, and by the time they knew what they'd fallen into, it was too late to do anything about it. 5. The ISIS Desert Dungeons. From 2015 to 2016, countless ISIS desert dungeons were found by rebel fighters retaking lost territory, including these brutally small enclosures found in Northern Syria, where Yazidi women were trapped for months in complete darkness and sweltering heat. Heartbreaking drawings found etched into the walls show depictions of the prisoners' former lives, and it is the tragic truth that many other dungeons like this are still active today. In June 2016, evidence emerged of what goes on in regular above-ground Islamic State dungeons too, as stories were told of children being flogged and beaten on the soles of their feet, and adults being slashed, beaten, and maimed in tiny cages trapped alongside the rotting corpses of their cellmates. We've seen the end game here in those ISIS promotional videos, so we know what happens to these unfortunate people, and that makes their routine performance of mock dungeon executions even worse. Number 4. Spielberg Castle. The dungeon in the Czech Republic's Spielberg Castle has seen some gruesome things in its time, as having originally been built in 1277 as a royal castle. By the 17th century, it had become a prison / fortress / castle / torture house / your skin wide open. Petty criminals and political insurgents were kept 200 to a room here, and the castle's vast labyrinth of dungeons gives you some idea of just how many people called this place home. It became one of the most feared places in all of Europe for a time, gaining the nickname the Prison of Nations, due to how many foreign fighters were tortured within its walls. If you were unlucky enough to be one of its prisoners, you'd likely only ever leave your cell to be chained to the walls and flayed, or strapped to a rack and stretched. And things didn't get much better when the castle played host to a new set of occupants sometime around 1939, the Nazis. Intriguingly, the German version of the name Spielberg is Spielberg. Anyone else want to see Steven's extended family tree right now? Let's get on that. But first, more Nazis. In at 3, the place of least resistance. It was pretty obvious that the Nazis were going to be on this list somewhere, but the exact site of one of their torture dungeons may just surprise you, as the chambers of despair you're looking at right now once sat beneath one of the world's most romantic and iconic landmarks, the Eiffel Tower. Directly below the Eiffel's butt crack, French resistance fighters were burnt at the stake by the Gestapo until they were toasted enough they'd give information. Those who resisted were reduced to ashes, and even those who gave in were eventually burnt en masse under the tower, as these hand marks on the walls hauntingly show. Number 2. The Water Dungeon. Water dungeons involve the idea of liquid being used to brutalize a person in a variety of creative and charming ways. The basic engineering is all the same. A person is kept inside a locked cage with spikes on the inside, and this cage is submerged into a vat of filthy water, often filled with garbage or sewage, until the prisoner is chest deep. Prisoners are kept in this situation in total darkness for weeks or sometimes months. And you'll notice I said prisoners are kept, not were kept. That's because this practice reportedly still occurs in modern-day China, where members of the Falun Gong have accused Chinese authorities of detaining and torturing them in these horrific conditions. 32-year-old Ding Yan was one, and she died in 2001 after being kept naked in a submerged, spiked iron cage for several months. One man who survived, Kang Hong, did so at a great cost, as having been kept handcuffed in a submerged cage too small for him to stand in. When Mr. Kang was released, his entire lower body was deformed and had begun to fester. This was mostly due to the fact that the water was full of dead rats and snakes, and having never been allowed out once, he was forced to defecate and urinate in his own watery prison. And at number 1, the Water House. Another kind of water dungeon could once be found in Amsterdam's Rasphaus prison, but here your grisly fate was entirely in your own two hands. The Rasphaus was designed as a rehabilitation facility rather than a place of punishment where errant young men were sent to learn the value of hard work and help to manufacture textile dye. However, prisoners who refused to work were sent to the Waterhouse. And if you didn't work here, you wouldn't make dye, you'd make dead. The Waterhouse consisted of a cellar which would fill with water or filth whenever a sluice was opened, and the only way to survive was to operate a pump continuously until the water was gone. Some men collapsed due to exhaustion and simply drowned, choking to death on the waste of humans. And only the strongest, or those whom the guards took pity on, would ever see the light of day again. And that's our list. Wasn't that just a rainbow of sunshine on a dreary day? If you need a little cheering up, then feel free to check out our recent video on the 7 strangest animal crimes. It's a lot cuter and fluffier than this video.